low at 6%. The tycoons feared a return to communism that would strip them of their fortunes and could even land them in jail. Even more importantly, they'd long been eyeing the crown jewels of Soviet industry, the state's biggest industrial giants. What they'd acquired so far was small scale compared to the vast resources still under the control of the state. Vladimir Putin, the smooth-talking son of a senior Soviet diplomat who'd become one of the country's major new bankers, concocted what seemed an ingenious scheme. He proposed that the young bankers offer to help out the cash-strapped Yeltsin government with a series of loans. As collateral, the tycoons would take stakes in a select handful of the nation's biggest enterprises. The tycoons would manage the enterprises and could sell off their stakes if the government was unable to pay the loans back. When the idea was first floated, outside observers scoffed that it would never gain any traction. The potential for corruption, they said, was too great. It would be too easy for the bankers simply to sell the stakes to themselves. But the young tycoons had powerful friends in the Yeltsin government. Prime among them was Anatoly Chubais, the red-haired deputy prime minister and close Gaidar ally, who'd been the architect of the privatization program so far. With strong support from the team of US economists, Chubais had been intent on breaking the hold of the state over the economy at any cost. Too much of the industry was still in the hands of the state, of Red Soviet-era directors and the KGB, while the threat of a return to communism seemed all too real. If the government signed off on the bankers' proposal, it would create a major new class of property owners overnight, as well as filling empty government coffers with a proposed $1.8 billion in loans. The tycoons would then back Yeltsin to the hilt against the communists to preserve their new wealth. Chubais believed it would signal a final victory for liberal reformers over the forces of the old guard. But the scheme would become one of the original sins of Russia's market transition. It tainted everything and opened the way for constant threats over the legality of the property the young tycoons acquired at that time. It became known as the loans for shares privatizations, an insider deal that transferred the nation's resource wealth into the young bankers' hands at a knockdown price. Far more financially nimble and able to access much bigger pools of ready cash through the rapid growth of their banks and the government deposits they held, the young tycoons outmaneuvered their former KGB masters. The combined forces of the KGB and the former Soviet directors managed to win only 2 of the auctions for stakes in oil companies, 5% of an oil firm named Lukoil and 40% of Surgutneftgaz, whose managers went to great lengths to keep the young bankers away. The nearest airport to the Siberian oil town of Surgut, where the sale was being held, was shut down, and armed guards manned roadblocks across the main routes in. Most of the rest of Soviet industry passed into the hands of the young bankers, in auctions that were widely seen as rigged. Potanin won the prize he'd long coveted, a controlling stake in the world's biggest producer of nickel and platinum, Norilsk Nickel, a sprawling plant high above the Arctic Circle, whose profits in 1995 stood at $1.2 billion. He'd done so by extending a loan of just $170 million to the government. And when, as expected, the still cash-strapped government defaulted on the loan after Yeltsin secured his election victory, the way was clear for Potanin to win the stake in an auction for little more than the loan price. Khodorkovsky had long been targeting Yukos, an oil producer in West Siberia which controlled some of Russia's largest reserves. He took control of it after lending the government $159 million for a 45% stake, and then paying a further $150 million in investment for an additional 33%. Another oil giant, Sibneft, was won for $100 million by Boris Berezovsky, who already controlled sales at Russia's biggest car maker and chaired a bank of his own. Most of these bankers were still barely in their 30s, but with the help of sympathetic government officials running the auction process, they were able to secure the foundations of fortunes that within a few years would be worth billions and then tens of billions of dollars. Berezovsky was soon crowing that a group of 7 bankers controlled 50% of the nation's economy. The loans for shares auctions marked a huge shift in the control of the economy. It was the moment the tycoons were transformed from mere bankers to owners of the biggest assets in the country, with access to some of the most lucrative cash flows. This is when they started to reinvent themselves, said Christian Michel. They acquired real assets. They became much more than banks. By the end of the 90s, the young tycoons were starting to turn around the Soviet legacy of falling production, deep debts and neglect. But for the members of the security services that had helped create these new billionaires, the loans for shares auction was a moment they would never forgive or forget, and would be the kernel for the KGB's later revanche. Before then, in the shadows, the KGB men had still been able to control much of the cash flow from the nation's oil wealth. But now they'd been outwitted and outpaced, and the financial reins had largely been taken out of their hands. This was the turning point when the young tycoons took control, said Rez Simonyan, the ally of Yevgeny Primakov, who'd worked on the early perestroika reforms. It changed the entire paradigm. But in those days, the tycoons of Russia's new order were giddy at their new wealth. They were fast becoming oligarchs who held considerable sway over the weakened Yeltsin government. The remaining members of the old guard security services, who had served in government, had been ousted amid scandal in the run-up to the presidential elections, and Western-leaning reformers like Chubais had been left to take the lead. Fresh from his successful engineering of the loans for shares sell-offs, Potanin took a post as Yeltsin's deputy prime minister, while Berezovsky was appointed secretary of the Security Council. Chubais became Yeltsin's chief of staff. It was the apotheosis of their era. The country, it seemed, was theirs. The forces of the KGB appeared to be receding into the background. But, said the former senior foreign intelligence operative Yuri Shvets, the oligarchs all forgot to whom they owed a debt. In the rush to shore up their positions, in the battle to accumulate more wealth, Khodorkovsky and the others didn't notice that nearby, in St. Petersburg, there was a chill in the air. Things were being run differently there. Isolated from the gold rush of Moscow's economic boom, the forces of the KGB were exerting far greater control, in a city where the economy was tougher and darker, in the violent scrabble for cash. Chapter 3. The Tip of an Iceberg. St. Petersburg. On the southwestern edge of St. Petersburg, where the Gulf of Finland starts to join the Baltic Sea, a tangle of cranes and containers juts out across the elegant facades of the pre-revolutionary palaces across the bay. On one small island, twisted heaps of scrap metal and piles of timber lie in wait for tankers, while across a channel, the red brick buildings that were once the customs house and the warehouses for the city's finest pre-revolutionary merchants somehow still stand, half abandoned among the heavy machinery. Far out on the western edge, a concrete jetty leads to the place sometimes called the Golden Gates, a concrete sprawl of oil storage facilities that marks St. Petersburg's most strategic outpost, the oil terminal that was the battleground for some of the 1990s most vicious bandit wars. The archipelago of islands is home to St. Petersburg's seaport, and through its channels, Russia's tumultuous history has always run deep. When Peter the Great founded St. Petersburg in the early 18th century, he did so in the hope that it would become Russia's greatest seaport, a vital link between the vast country's Eurasian landmass and the markets of the West. Thousands of serfs toiled and died to realize his vision of stately Baroque mansions and elegant canals rising out of the freezing and muddy marshes. St. Petersburg was always intended as Russia's window on the West, a port city that would drag the country kicking and screaming out of its medieval and Asiatic past, no matter what the cost. Ships carrying cargoes of cloth, tea, silk and spices began to arrive in ever greater numbers from the colonial empires of the West, while Russia's imperial riches of timber, furs, hemp and potash steamed out. St. Petersburg's merchants and noblemen thrived, but as the city's population exploded, its workers were among the world's most downtrodden. Dockers hauled cargoes on and off the ships on their backs, unprotected from the ice and bitter winds that gripped the port for half of the year. When Vladimir Lenin gathered the city's workers to overthrow the rule of the provisional government in 1917, the dockers were foremost among them. When the city, by then named Leningrad, came under blockade by the Nazis during the Second World War, the seaport was on the front line of the heart-rending struggles to survive starvation and bombs. And when Russia jutted out of its third revolution of the 20th century, the St. Petersburg seaport again had a defining role to play. It became the ground zero for an alliance between the KGB and organized crime that was to expand its influence across Russia, and later into Western markets and institutions too. It was the starting point for the business alliances of the city's deputy mayor, Vladimir Putin, who worked closely with the organized crime leader who ran it, and the oil trader who gained a monopoly on exports through its oil terminal. The relationships forged then, through an elaborate web of barter and export deals, became a model for how Putin's Russia would be run. In the early 90s, the port was one of the darkest places in a city riven by gangland shootings and violent battles for cash. The story of the seaport is a very criminal and dirty story, said one former senior official in the St. Petersburg City Council. The port was totally criminalized. There was a lot of shooting, according to a former member of the biggest local crime gang, the Tambov Group. The group who eventually took it over were part of a nexus of organized crime and KGB men that came to rule the roost in St. Petersburg in the 90s, and Vladimir Putin was at the center of it. If in Moscow the forces of the KGB had stayed largely in the shadows, in St. Petersburg they were much more visible. St. Petersburg's economy was far smaller than Moscow's, the battle for cash much more vicious, and the mayor's office had tentacles extending into most businesses. The main reason for the potency of the KGB's reach in St. Petersburg was that Mayor Anatoly Sobchak had little interest in the day-to-day running of the city. He left it to Putin, who ran the Foreign Relations Committee, which oversaw all trade and much of the rest of the city's business, and to his other deputy, Vladimir Yakovlev, who was in charge of the city's economic affairs. Sobchak and his deputies moved the mayor's office from the Mariinsky Palace, where St. Petersburg Democrat-run city council had its seat, to the Warren-like offices of the Smolny Institute, from which the Communist Party had run the city since the days of Lenin's takeover. The legacy they inherited was desperate. The city's coffers were empty. There was no cash to pay for imports, and the shop shelves were fast emptying. Domestic food production was in a parlous state. Grain was left to rot at the roadside by inefficient state collective farms, while a series of bad harvests made things even worse. They not only had to deal with the food crisis, but also with an explosion of crime. In the chaos of the Soviet collapse, the institutions of power appeared to be melting away. Organized crime groups moved in to fill the vacuum, running protection rackets, extorting local businesses, and taking over trade. From his office behind the stately columns and fading facade of the Smolny Institute, Sobchak seemed incapable of dealing with the deteriorating situation. He was a convincing and powerful orator who prided himself on his appearance, but his relations with what remained of the city's law enforcement were fraught. Sobchak was a moron, said one former senior KGB officer who worked for a time with Putin in St. Petersburg. He wanted to wear the sharpest suits, and he could give speeches for hours on end. He loved all the attributes of power, and his wife wanted to live like an aristocrat. He liked to travel in limousines, but someone needed to work. Who was going to clean the shit from the streets and deal with the bandits? Few in law enforcement would even take Sobchak's calls. The former chairman of the St. Petersburg KGB would not even go into a room with him, the former KGB officer said. If you tried to explain to him how security worked, it would be the same as explaining nuclear physics. But with Putin, you could explain. You could say, Volodya, there is this situation and there is this one. And when he had to phone up the police to sort out situations, for him, they would not put down the phone. So Sobchak came to rely on Putin, who had maintained a network of connections with the top of the city's KGB. His former mentor in the Leningrad KGB's feared dissident fighting 5th Directorate, Viktor Cherkasov, was the new head of St. Petersburg's FSB, the KGB's successor agency. Putin became the point man for dealing with law enforcement. He was someone who could phone someone and say, "We have to do something, otherwise there's going to be a nightmare," the former KGB officer said. He could agree with a general who before had handled special forces, who could tell him how to handle something and maybe provide backup. They were people with connections. The system had collapsed, but part of it had remained. What emerged out of the chaos and collapse, and Sobchak's ineffectiveness, was an alliance between Putin, his KGB allies, and organized crime that sought to run much of the city's economy for their own benefit. Instead of seeking to impose order for the good of the city's population, the only order they imposed was mostly for themselves. Above all, the collapse meant opportunity for their own enrichment, and in particular for Putin and his allies in the KGB, for the creation of a strategic slush fund that was to preserve their networks and secure their position for years to come. The slush fund had its roots in the barter schemes of KGB-run friendly firms. Later, they extended to the seaport, and then to the oil terminal itself. Running through it all was St. Petersburg's Tambov organized crime group. It was a business, according to one former local FSB officer, that consisted of murder and raiding. The arms of the Tambov group were covered in blood. It was near the end of 1991 when Marina Salye first noticed something was wrong. The firebrand Democrat, who at one point had rivaled Sobchak as St. Petersburg's Democratic leader, had been tasked by the head of the city council to find ways out of the food crisis. A doughty geologist in her mid-50s, with soft greying hair and shadows sunk deep under determined eyes, Salye was relentless. That autumn, she'd successfully pushed for the city to introduce a system of ration cards. It was the first time food had been rationed since the terrible days of starvation of the Leningrad blockade. She'd now decided to push for a barter scheme that would allow the city to exchange raw materials for imports of food. It seemed the only way out of the impasse. A system had already been set up on a federal level to deal with the crisis that was facing the entire country. The Moscow government had begun issuing quotas that allowed the export of set quantities of natural resources held by state-owned enterprises, such as oil products, metals and timber, in exchange for food. But as Salye began to push the mayor's office to apply for the export quotas for St. Petersburg, she got wind of rumours that Putin's Foreign Relations Committee had already been granted them. What quotas? Where are the quotas? Officially no one knew anything, she later told an interviewer. When she tried to extract more information from the mayor's office, no one answered her letters. The scheme, she found out, had been underway since at least the beginning of December, and no one had been informed. The biggest problem of all was that the expected food imports were nowhere to be found. As the city entered the new year, it had only 1 month's worth of food reserves left. Salye launched a parliamentary inquiry demanding information on the deals. When Putin eventually bowed to demands and addressed the city council, pale-eyed and defiant, he turned up with just 2 pages of notes and told the MPs that everything else was a commercial secret. What he told Parliament differed greatly from the documents Salye was eventually able to retrieve from the State Customs Committee and other officials as she ramped up her investigation. By the time she'd pieced everything together, it had become clear that Putin's committee had handed out more than $95 million in export licenses to an obscure web of front companies, while virtually none of the food imports expected in return had arrived. A further $900 million worth of export quotas had been granted by the federal government, including one for $717 million worth of aluminium. It was impossible to tell whether Putin had gone ahead and handed out the additional $900 million in quotas to other firms, which also disappeared with the proceeds, as Salye had been unable to access any further documentation. But she suspected that he had. As Salye and her deputies dug through the paperwork, the scandal seemed to grow. State customs officials and St. Petersburg's representative from the Foreign Trade Ministry had written to Putin complaining that he'd issued the export licenses in violation of laws governing such barter deals. An expert opinion, commissioned by Salye's committee, warned that the companies involved were so obscure they could disappear with the proceeds from the sales overnight. Most of them were to receive mind-blowing commissions for their services, 25 to 50% of the value of the deals instead of the usual 3 or 4%. A handful of the contracts appeared to allow the companies to purchase raw materials for far less than the market price. One quota awarded by Putin allowed for an outfit created just 2 months before the scheme took off to acquire 13,997 kilograms of rare earth metals for 2,000 times less than the global market price, enabling it to reap vast profits when it sold it all on world markets. The scheme Salye had uncovered was almost identical to the practices deployed by KGB joint ventures in the dying days of the Soviet Union, which had led to a flood of raw materials being siphoned out of the country from state-owned enterprises at the low internal Soviet price, while the profits from the subsequent sales at much higher world prices remained in bank accounts abroad. In those days, any outfit that wanted to export raw materials had to receive a special license to do so from the Ministry of Foreign Trade, whose ranks were mostly manned by associates of the KGB. When the Russian government launched a series of barter schemes intended to staunch the looming humanitarian crisis following the Soviet collapse, the deals followed a similar route. But Putin had special permission to award his own quotas, licenses and contracts for the city's so-called oil-for-food deals, bypassing the need to agree each one with the ministry. He'd been granted this by the Minister for Foreign Trade himself, Pyotr Avin, the same bespectacled economist who'd worked closely on reforms with Gaidar in the early 80s, and who then protected Putin when the oil for food deals came under scrutiny. One of the contracts Putin handed out was to a Soviet-Finnish joint venture called Sphinx, which at the end of December 1991 was awarded a quota to trade diesel fuel, cement and fertilizer in exchange for 200,000 tons of livestock grain. Another was a Soviet-German entity named Tamigo, given a license to trade 500 tons of copper in return for supplies of sugar and cooking oil. GCOP, the outfit that was awarded the contract to acquire 13,997 kilograms of rare earth metals for 2,000 times below the market price, was co-run by the brother of one of Putin's university classmates, who shared Putin's love for martial arts. Another recipient of diesel oil quotas was a firm called Intercommerce, run by Gennady Miroshnik, a convicted criminal who'd participated in a scheme that siphoned 20 million Deutschmarks from funds earmarked for the relocation of the Soviet Union's armed forces from East Germany. Later, Putin's wife Lyudmila told a friend that Intercommerce was linked to East Germans her husband met in Dresden. The barter deals were handed out to his friends, said Alexander Belyayev, the then head of the St. Petersburg City Council who oversaw Salyer's investigation. They had to be given to people Putin trusted. There was no legal tender process then, so it was clear they would be given to people he knew personally, to people he could control. For the oil product sales, this was mostly connected to Kirishi. They were near monopolists. This was Timchenko, Katkov, Malov. The men Putin was apparently handing the deals to appeared to represent far more than a network of friends. One of them, Gennady Timchenko, was a spry man with a charming smile, who was fluent in German and English, with a smattering of French. He and his partners, Andrei Katkov and Evgeny Malov, had set up the Kirishin Eftakim export oil trader when Gorbachev first loosened trade in 1987, granting 70 organizations, including the Kirishi oil refinery near Leningrad, the right to trade outside the Soviet monopoly. All Katkov and Malov had done at their previous posts in the Soviet Foreign Trade Ministry was stamp and file papers for export deals, and they leapt at the chance to enter into their own business. Timchenko appeared to be a different matter. His official biography said he'd worked as a senior engineer at the Foreign Trade Ministry, but according to 3 people familiar with the matter, he'd taken a very different route. He'd studied German together with Putin at the KGB's Red Banner Academy before Putin was sent to Dresden and Timchenko to Vienna and Zurich, where 2 former senior officers for the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service said he had worked as an undercover agent for Soviet trade organizations. It's possible, according to a 3rd former officer speaking to Russian newspaper Vedomosti, that he was sent there to handle bank accounts funding the KGB's networks of illegals. I don't rule out that Timchenko knew Putin then, one of the former officers archly told me. Timchenko has repeatedly denied any connection to the KGB, saying any such connection is untrue. A senior Russian banker with ties to the security services also indicated he had links to Putin during his Dresden days. While Timchenko was also previously denied that his Kirishin Eftakim export had ever been involved in the scandal-racked oil for food deals, adding later that all his firm's activities were transparent and legitimate, one of Timchenko's former partners told me his firm had participated, as did 2 other associates. They insisted that all the food they'd been tasked with importing had been delivered to St. Petersburg. But overall, the scheme ended disastrously. Only a tiny fraction of the food due to be imported had ever turned up. Instead, Salyer suspected KGB networks were being preserved. Salyer told a friend she felt her inquiry had uncovered the tip of an iceberg. What lay beneath, she believed, was a huge structure that had its origins in the foreign slush funds of the KGB, the networks of which the scheme was designed to maintain. Salyer, it turns out, was probably right. Salyer was a fool. This all happened, but this is absolutely normal trading operations. How can you explain this to a menopausal woman like that? It was May 2013, more than 20 years since the scheme was set up, and Philippe Turova, a former senior officer for the Foreign Intelligence Directorate of the KGB, was telling for the first time the story of how he helped Putin set up the St. Petersburg oil for food scheme. We were sitting in the sun on the terrace of a cafe in Boadillo del Monte, a sleepy market town in the hills near Madrid. The scheme that had been publicly presented in the early 90s as a mechanism to bring in vitally needed imports of food, Turova claimed, actually had a different purpose. It was never really intended that the food would arrive. There were much bigger problems to deal with. All this bullshit about the report of Marina Salye, this was absolutely beside the point. The situation was one of total collapse. There was an absolute lack of federal finance for projects, and Moscow only drank and stole. In order for everything not to collapse, we had to do something. It was like a ship without a captain, and when you try to turn the wheel, it falls off. This was what it was like. If we had not started work, then St. Petersburg would have drowned in shit. Built like a bodybuilder, with a shaved head and dark glasses, Turova had a demonic laugh and a treasure trove of stories about the Soviet collapse. He was from the elite of the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service. His father had taught languages at the KGB Red Banner Academy and served as a translator to Leonid Brezhnev. Giulio Andreotti, the long-serving Italian Prime Minister, was among his friends. In Soviet times, Turova had worked closely with Vladimir Osintsev, the legendary komitetchik who headed the so-called Party Technology Division of the Central Committee's International Department, running black operations and illegals deep into countries where the Communist Party was banned. In the chaos that followed the Soviet collapse, Turova had been charged with finding ways to pay debts owed to the friendly firms at the heart of the clandestine financing schemes of the KGB and party influence operations abroad, many of which also supplied crucial equipment, including for energy infrastructure, to the Soviet Union at a marked-up price. The problem was that when the USSR collapsed, Russia had agreed to take on all the foreign debts of the former Soviet republics in exchange for their foreign property, and had then promptly pronounced itself bankrupt. An international moratorium had been announced on all Russia's foreign debts. Turova, who needed to bypass this in order to pay the friendly firms without anyone finding out, claimed that the barter schemes were in fact set up as a way to do so. Eventually, he'd set up a channel for payments through a small Swiss bank in Lugano, documents show. "We could not say we paid someone and did not pay Philip Morris," he said. "This was not a small matter. For some things, we needed to pay right away. If we did not pay for equipment for nuclear power plants, then we would have a catastrophe. When the country stopped existing, everyone had stopped supplies." Turova had been sent to St. Petersburg, he said, to help Putin set up his own scheme to pay off debts to some of the friendly firms. One of them, he claimed, was an Italian outfit called Casa Grande del Favore, which he said was one of a handful of engineering firms capable of the delicate operations required for repairs of the sewage system that crisscrossed St. Petersburg's myriad of canals. "We had to pay, because without completion of the work, St. Petersburg would be covered to the tops of its cupolas in crap." He'd advised Putin to set up the oil for food scheme, he said, because we needed to have operative instruments to be able to pay someone off fast. Turova was essentially admitting that from the start, the scheme had been intended not to bring in imports of food, but to create a hard currency slush fund for the city. But without any oversight, there was no way of telling whether any of the funds were actually used to pay off the debts to the friendly firms, or whether they were in fact funneled to networks of KGB agents still operating abroad. Turova claimed there was no other way to operate, because the Russian state bank in charge of foreign operations, Vneshekonombank, was in a state of collapse. All of its accounts had been frozen January 1st, 1992, when the Russian government announced it had run out of funds. "It was a pure necessity," said Turova. "It was not possible to pay the expenditures of the city any other way." Any hard currency accounts officially connected to City Hall would be frozen, along with the other accounts impounded under the Soviet bankruptcy. If they'd kept it on the accounts of the city, it would mean the same thing as keeping the cash in VEB. But if you had funds somewhere in foreign accounts, in Liechtenstein, then you could pay immediately. Russia's central bank had used the same reasoning when it tried to explain away a scandal that emerged later in the 90s, when it emerged that it had transferred tens of billions of the country's hard currency reserves through a small offshore firm in Jersey named Fimico, which had been established in November 1990, shortly after Ivashko ordered the creation of the invisible party economy. The secret transfers through Fimico, the Russian central bank chief later argued, had been necessary to protect the funds from being seized after the Soviet Union pronounced itself bankrupt, and to pay off the foreign debts of the Soviet international banking network. But there was zero oversight over any of the transactions, and rather than paying down debts, many suspected most of the money was used to fund the foreign networks of the KGB. In many ways, the central bank's Fimiko operations and Putin's oil-for-food scheme were cut from the same cloth. They looked to be part of the black cash of the Russian regime, and were so lacking in transparency that they could just as easily be used as the personal slush funds of the officials running Russia. Turova insisted that Putin never stole from the slush funds he helped create through the oil-for-food scheme. But he spent money, of course. Of course he spent some of the money, and somehow managed this money because he needed to travel to pay for hotels, and he probably needed to eat as well. In essence, what had been created was what in Russian criminal parlance is called an obzhak, a common cash pot or slush fund for a criminal gang. It was a model based on handing out riches to a tightly controlled network of close allies, where the lines between what was to be used for strategic operations and what was for personal use were always conveniently blurred. This model became the basis for the kleptocracy of the Putin regime, and later its influence operations too, and it was based on the clandestine networks and payment systems of the KGB. As for Salye, she was sidelined as a political figure. Sobchak blocked any further investigation of his young protege's oil-for-food deals. In the mid-90s, she moved to Moscow, where her voice was drowned out in the capital's political din. On the eve of Putin's election as president, however, she resurfaced to publish the first in-depth investigative article on the deals, titling it V. Putin, the president of a corrupt oligarchy. Although her findings created a furore among liberals, they had little impact nationwide. Soon after the election, she withdrew to the depths of the countryside near the border with Finland, miles down a bone-shaking road from the nearest town. Only a handful of journalists made the journey to interview her there, but the scheme and her investigation of it remained her abiding obsession till the day she died, just weeks after Putin began his third term in 2012. She knew she'd glimpsed the true nature of his regime in those deals. Trader, submariner, soldier, spy. The KGB men who took over St. Petersburg with Putin were far more commercially minded than the generation that had gone before. Though they mourned the collapse of the Soviet Empire, many in the younger middle echelon of the security services, like Putin, had fast embraced the tenets of capitalism and rejected the dogma of the Communist Party. For this new generation, it had been communism that failed the empire, leaving them high and dry in Afghanistan and abandoning them in East Germany. They saw communism as having betrayed them, said Andrei Illarionov, the former presidential economic advisor to Putin. They were the product of the operations the KGB launched in the final years of the Soviet rule to create networks of foreign firms. The secrecy surrounding these activities meant that from the beginning, the methods of the KGB men of the 80s resembled money laundering operations. Once the oil-for-food scheme was done, Putin's allies began to move in on the seaport, which initially, together with the oil terminal and a fleet of ships, was part of a vast state holding company known as the Leningrad Baltic Sea Fleet, or BMP. In Soviet times, the KGB had manned the fleet ships as trade aids to the captains. They knew intimately its trade routes, its cargoes, the contraband, and the money to be made. In its heyday, hundreds of ships had set out from Leningrad carrying oil products, metals, and grain, while others arrived from as far away as South America carrying fruit, sugar, and smuggled goods, vital for underground operations and cash. In those days, the BMP represented the city's most strategic cash flow. Even in 1991, the year of the Soviet collapse, its net profits were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It was not only the owner of nearly 200 passenger and cargo ships, it also controlled the entire Leningrad seaport, including its oil terminal, as well as the neighbouring ports in Vyborg and Kaliningrad. It was the key to the city's wealth. The man who ran the Baltic Sea Fleet at the time of Yeltsin's revolution, Viktor Karchenko, was an avowed liberal who, under Gorbachev's perestroika reforms, had won the government's permission to carve out the company as his own fiefdom. Square-jawed and built like a tank, Karchenko had become increasingly independent. He'd risen from a childhood spent in an orphanage to become one of the city's most revered businessmen. In 1990, under his watch, the BMP became an enterprise he rented from the state, which kept 50% of its profits for reinvestment. He'd grown close to Yeltsin, and when the communist regime collapsed in the wake of the failed August putsch, he unceremoniously kicked all the KGB men out of the fleet. Karchenko was carving out a separate power base, just at the time the St. Petersburg KGB men most urgently wanted to keep control of the cash flow. In the chaos of the Soviet collapse, and with organised crime groups also trying to get a piece of the port and the oil terminal, it took over a year for them to exact their revenge. One of the first moves was made quietly. Late one evening in February 1993, Viktor Karchenko was returning home from a meeting with Yeltsin in Moscow when police stopped the Red Arrow train he was travelling on just outside St. Petersburg. He was hauled off the train, charged with siphoning $37,000 out of the Baltic Sea Fleet, and jailed. Karchenko was released on bail 4 months later, but he was removed from his post in charge of the BMP. The St. Petersburg KGB men installed their own director, sold off the fleet of ships one by one, and transferred them to a myriad of offshore companies. In the process, one of the BMP's directors was shot dead. "It was a real raider attack," said one of Karchenko's associates. "They sold off the ships for nothing. Everything disappeared. They siphoned everything out of the country." Karchenko's former associates still fear to speak of what happened back then, or about who was behind the attack. But the footprints of the local KGB men were everywhere. "They needed to clean their boots and eat," said one. "They didn't pay attention to anyone. They just took BMP and looted it." The raid was a foretaste of operations that were to come later. The KGB men had bent St. Petersburg's law enforcement to their will to take over the city's most important trading link. Karchenko had been removed as BMP chief at a crucial moment. At the same time, the port and the oil terminal were being carved out from the Baltic Sea Fleet into separate entities and privatised by Putin's City Hall. "They pulled out the harbour walls from BMP," said a former Karchenko associate. Submariner. As City Hall began to privatise part of its stake in the seaport, Ilya Traber, an alleged St. Petersburg mobster later named by Spanish prosecutors as an associate of the Tambov Group, was quick off the mark. His men brought up shares from the port's workers, who'd received them as vouchers as soon as the sell-off began. The process was violent. There were huge violations in the privatisation of the port, but all this was covered up, said a former Traber associate. From the beginning, Traber seemed to have an inside track. On paper, the state retained a 49% stake in the port, 20% through the Federal Property Ministry and 29% through St. Petersburg City Hall. But a clerk at the City Hall Property Department somehow lost the City Hall voting rights to the 29% stake through a mistaken stroke of a pen, leaving Traber and his associates free to do as they wished. The raider takeover would not have happened without help from the mayor's office, said a former city FSB officer. After a series of violent struggles, Traber, who'd become the quintessential intermediary between the St. Petersburg KGB men and the Tambov Group, established control over the oil terminal too. He'd first arrived in Leningrad in the early 80s as an ex-officer from the Soviet nuclear submarine fleet. A squat and burly man with a thick neck and close-set eyes, he'd washed up at a city centre bar named Zhiguli, a favourite haunt of Leningrad street thugs and budding black marketeers. Traber worked there as a barman and administrator, and in the bar's dark reaches he began to trade in hard currency, and then in the city's rich collection of Tsarist-era antiques. He soon cornered the market, earning himself the nickname Antiquar. By the end of the 80s, he was moving his business out of the black market and into the light, setting up the city's finest antique store on Nevsky Prospect. There he established ties with St. Petersburg's newly elected mayor Anatoly Sobchak and his wife Lyudmila Narusova, who became frequent customers, forging a close relationship with Traber that was to last long after Sobchak's time in office. Traber had always worked closely with the city's KGB, without whose assistance it wouldn't have been possible for him to smuggle antiques. It was clear he had deep ties with the city's law enforcement, said a former senior official from the city parliament. He was also in business with the Tambov Group, said a former FSB officer who worked in the St. Petersburg Contraband Division. Soldier. At that time, the Tambov was becoming the city's most powerful organised crime group. Its leader, Vladimir Kumarin, had served time in jail in 1991 following a violent battle with another of the city's mafia groups. After he emerged from prison, with the help of Putin, Traber and his men, the Tambov began taking control of St. Petersburg's entire fuel and energy business. The battles with rival gangs continued. In 1994, Kumarin lost one of his arms in a bomb attack. By that time, however, he was creating the St. Petersburg Fuel Company, or PTK, which became the city's monopoly domestic oil distributor, while Ilya Traber was taking over control of the seaport and the oil terminal on the Tambov's behalf. Later, Spanish prosecutors described Traber as a co-owner with Kumarin of PTK. Kumarin became so powerful that he was known as St. Petersburg's night governor. In essence, he was the dark side of City Hall. Putin seemed to be central to these maneuverings, the point man providing logistical support from the mayor's office. Together with his trusted deputy, Igor Sechin, who towered over a lectern in an anteroom outside Putin's office, vetting all who entered, he was the one who issued the licenses that allowed Traber to control the port and the oil terminal. He was the one who granted Kumarin's PTK an exclusive contract to supply fuel for the city's ambulances, buses, taxis and police cars. The first sign of his cooperation with the Tambov Group came late in the summer of 1992, when his Foreign Relations Committee registered a Russo-German joint venture, the St. Petersburg Immobilien Aktiengesellschaft, or SPAG, for investing in the city's real estate business. Much later, German prosecutors would allege that SPAG was a vehicle for laundering illicit funds for the Tambov Group, as well as for a Colombian drugs cartel. During his stint as St. Petersburg's deputy mayor, Putin served on SPAG's advisory board. The Kremlin said this was no more than one of many such honorary positions he held as deputy mayor. But one of SPAG's co-founders said he met Putin 5 or 6 times to discuss SPAG's St. Petersburg business. Trader. For Gennady Timchenko, the alleged former KGB operative who'd apparently known Putin since their days studying spycraft together at the Red Banner Academy, gaining access to the oil terminal had also always been key. He prided himself on the powers of persuasion, and in later interviews he'd often explain his success with a nod and a wink about his ability to sell anything to anyone. Since childhood, he'd been part of the Soviet elite. His father held a senior rank in the armed forces, and he spent some of his early years in East Germany. His knowledge of German helped secure him a job in Soviet foreign trade and propelled him into the ranks of the KGB, where he worked undercover as a trade representative in Vienna and Switzerland. Through his connections, he forged a partnership with a former senior KGB officer, Andrei Panikov, a thick-set man with a broad grin and hands as big as dinner plates. Panikov had studied offshore finance at the Soviet Trade Institute, and then, with the blessing of the KGB's foreign intelligence chief, Leonid Shebashin, set up the first joint venture to be licensed to export oil products outside the Soviet monopoly. Timchenko's Kirishi Neftekim export oil trader formed a partnership with Panikov's Urals Trading, and for a time, from 1990, Timchenko headed Urals branch in Finland. According to a report by French intelligence, the company had initially been set up by the KGB in the 80s as part of a network of firms to transfer assets for the Communist Party, a claim Timchenko denied. Even with all their connections, for at least 2 years, Timchenko and Panikov were unable to gain access to the St. Petersburg oil terminal. Not only was it part of Karchenko's fiefdom, but as the power of the Soviet Union fractured, it became a vicious battleground for the city's warring criminal groups. The oil trader Timchenko co-founded had ready access to supplies as the in-house trading arm of the nearby Kirishi refinery, part of the Surgut Neftagaz oil company. But without access to the St. Petersburg terminal, it was forced to export its oil by rail to neighbouring posts in Estonia or Finland, a much costlier route. Gaining control of exports through the St. Petersburg terminal became so important that Timchenko turned to Putin for assistance. In January 1992, together with Panikov's Urals Trading, Timchenko set up a joint venture with Putin's Foreign Relations Committee called Golden Gates. They aimed to bypass the existing terminal, beset by rival gangs and under Karchenko's ultimate control, and raise Western financing to build a new, upgraded terminal. This was the first time the ties between Putin and Timchenko had emerged into the open. For almost a year, Putin led discussions with France's BNP Paribas on a credit facility for the new oil terminal, backed by exports through Urals Trading. But the talks fell apart when one of the key negotiators, a former KGB officer operating in Paris named Mikhail Gandorin, died just before the loan was to be approved. It looked like he'd been given something, one former Timchenko partner involved in the process said. He called me 2 days before he died, and he couldn't speak. That summer, another member of the Golden Gates group, Sergei Shutov, was threatened and told to stay away from the project. The project was under severe attack, with St. Petersburg's mafia groups, including the Tambov, battling each other to gain control of revenues from the existing terminal. The pressure mounted to such a degree that, according to two senior Western bankers, Putin sent his two young daughters away to Germany for their safety. There is no indication Timchenko had any involvement in the violent struggles that accompanied Traber's takeover of the port and oil terminal. But eventually, instead of building a new terminal, the way was opened for him to win a monopoly on exports through the existing terminal. Two former Traber associates and a former KGB associate claimed Timchenko would only have been able to gain such monopoly through forging some kind of working relationship with Traber. Traber always had good relations with Timchenko, said one of Traber's former associates. The monopoly Timchenko won on exports would only have been possible through such ties. If you need to ship oil and the port is full of bandits, then you need to agree, said a former senior KGB officer who worked with Putin in the 90s. There was no way to go through without their agreement. Lawyers for Timchenko said the relationship was no more than a commercial arm's-length one, while any suggestion Timchenko had any involvement with organized crime, corruption, or any other improper or illegal activity in St. Petersburg, whether via Mr. Traber or in any other way, was false and libelous. In 2011, a Timchenko representative told Russia's Novaya Gazeta Timchenko was acquainted with the co-owner of Traber in the seaport and oil terminal, Dmitry Skigin, but the two men had not engaged in any joint business projects. At the same time, Timchenko was drawing on a network of KGB-linked foreign bankers to finance his trading operations. First, there was Dresdner Bank, headed in St. Petersburg by one of Putin's former Stasi comrades, Matthias Warnig, who worked with him in Dresden as part of a KGB cell. Then there was Andrei Akimov, who'd worked with Evgeny Primakov in the Institute of World Economy before becoming the youngest head of the Soviet Foreign Bank in Vienna, where in the year before the Soviet fall, he set up his own private venture, IMAG, which provided financing to Timchenko. As Timchenko's business flourished, his network of companies stretched from Finland to Monaco to Liechtenstein. All the while, Putin assisted, issuing the licenses allowing Timchenko to use the oil storage facilities at Traber's seaport and acting as the middleman in a supply arrangement between Timchenko's Kirishi Neftekim export and Kumarin's PTK. Kumarin, meanwhile, joined the board of both outfits' supplier, the Kirishi oil refinery. It was all very well organized, said Maxim Friedsson, co-owner of another oil trader in the city. Putin and his guys ensured support from City Hall. Because of his KGB past, he could help with the logistical organization. It was all one team. The alliance that was forged then took KGB traditions from before the Soviet collapse and put them to a still more commercial use. As far as I remember, the symbiosis between the bandits and the KGB had always existed, said Friedsson. The KGB had worked with the bandits in the currency markets and in prostitution rings. They were sources of information. It was a natural symbiosis. Neither of them had any moral limits. The bandits were like the infantry for them. They would take all the risks. Putin's interest in St. Petersburg's seaport and oil terminal often seemed more direct than that of a state official responsible for the city's share. The alliance he built with Ilya Traber and his men troubled even visiting businessmen. When one was brought in to help arrange financing for the port, he was whisked from the city's Pulkovo airport straight to Traber's lair in an armoured car, accompanied by police and Traber's guards. On arrival at the high-gated compound in a back street, he was escorted past armed guards and snarling German shepherds. After passing through several rooms adorned with icons, he arrived at an inner chamber where Traber was waiting, wearing a tracksuit bottom and slippers, a thick chain with a huge gold cross around his neck, the uniform of the city's bandits. The businessman was left in no doubt about whom he was meeting. It was like in the movies, he said. My heart stopped when I saw him. The scene was far from what he had expected when he was invited by an official from City Hall to assist with financing the port. But after a tense discussion with Traber, he received a nod of approval. The next day, he was taken to more salubrious surroundings, the downtown law offices of one of Traber's business partners, Boris Sharikov, on one of St. Petersburg's most picturesque canals. Also at the meeting was a former KGB officer who'd become another of Traber's partners, as well as Putin and the City Hall property chief Mikhail Manovich, and a smooth-talking 30-something named Dmitry Skigin. who, the businessman was to learn, owned the port jointly with Traber. Skigin was the acceptable face of the port, a mild-mannered geek, fluent in the language of international finance, a disciplined businessman who went mountain climbing in his spare time and spoke English and French. His father, Edouard, was close to Putin, according to Monaco intelligence. But according to two of Skigin's former business partners, he was also a front for another St. Petersburg crime boss, a pugnacious former boxer named Sergei Vassiliev, with whom Traber had agreed a fragile peace for joint control of the port, and later for its oil terminal. The alliance St. Petersburg's administration forged with the Tambov Group became embedded deep in the city's infrastructure. With the help of Putin's men in City Hall, the seaport became a major hub for smuggling drugs from Colombia into Western Europe. Former senior KGB officer Yuri Shvets later testified to a London court. One of Putin's closest allies in the St. Petersburg security services, Viktor Ivanov, had assisted the Tambov Group in taking over the seaport, while Putin provided protection from the mayor's office, he said. Ivanov strenuously denied the claim, but many other signs emerged that the St. Petersburg port was a vital channel for drug trafficking. Control of the port became so strategic that when in 1997 the property department chief Mikhail Manovich sought to return the voting rights City Hall had lost to its 29% stake during its privatization, he was shot dead by a sniper as he drove to work. Manovich was pushing for it all to be returned to the state, said a former Traber associate. The leverage that he had was that he could refuse to extend the license for the long-term rent of the port, including the oil terminal. And for this, he paid with his life. Vyacheslav Shevchenko, a former member of the St. Petersburg Parliament and a close Manovich ally, testified to the police murder inquiry that in the final days of his life, Manovich had been deeply troubled by the situation at the port. On his request, I went twice to the port and spoke with the head of the port. I made a proposal that the English insurance company Lloyd's should come to analyse the port's financial situation. A week later, too, bandits visited me and told me if I went to the port again, my head would be cut off with an axe. Traber refused to comment for this book, saying the allegations were fantasy and slander. Just 3 months after Manovich's murder, the port shareholders agreed to extend a new long-term management contract for the port to a new Traber company, OBIB, owned by a Liechtenstein foundation called Nasdor Incorporated. Later, the only person who ever dared to speak out publicly about the looting of the Baltic Sea Fleet was the city's mayor at the time it occurred, Anatoly Sobchak. Long after he had stepped down, he wrote a newspaper article in which, for the first and only time, he publicly criticised the actions of the city's post-Soviet KGB. The prosecutors, the FSB and the policemen who took part in this should be charged with abusing their position and for causing the country enormous loss, he wrote. 4 months later, he was dead. I fear this was what cost Sobchak his life, said an associate of Karchenko. In the eyes of Putin's KGB allies, the alliances they forged then were necessary as the only way to restore some degree of control in the chaos of the Soviet collapse. The organised crime groups were the infantrymen they needed to help control the masses, the men on the street, as well as in the prisons, according to one of Putin's associates then. This was a typical KGB practice, forged in the Soviet past when Putin, for instance, had run illegals through East Germany. They worked with people. This is what they did, said a former KGB officer who worked with them. Imagine you need to calm down a bunch of alpha males. If you can't shoot them, this is terribly difficult work. But the argument that they needed to do this, if they were to bring order, was only a self-justification behind the power grab. The oil for food scheme had also been set up ostensibly to save the city, whether to bring in food or to pay down debts. But all it had achieved was to create a network of black cash to preserve the power and the networks of the KGB. In the skein of these relationships, another thread led to one of the structures set up for the Communist Party's invisible economy in the final days of its rule. This was Bank Russia, a small St. Petersburg bank which was one more key intermediary in some of the oil-for-food barter deals. Like many of the institutions and firms set up by the party in the dying days of the regime, when the August 1991 putsch failed and the Soviet Communist Party was banned, control of Bank Russia passed noiselessly into the hands of representatives of the KGB. Its new shareholders included a senior KGB officer and 2 KGB-connected physicists, who specialized in rare earth metals, materials so rare and so strategic that trade in them could only be handled by members of the KGB. Spy. When the senior KGB officer Vladimir Yakunin returned to Leningrad in February 1991, a year after Putin, from a posting undercover at the United Nations in New York, he was shocked by the conditions that greeted him. He'd come from a comfortable residence in New York to the grime of a working-class area of Leningrad, where the street lamps rarely shone and his wife would return home from the shops in tears because the only thing on the shelves was pickled cucumbers. In essence, the country that had sent me to work abroad, and in which I grew up and where my children were born, had ceased to exist, he said. So too had the values, the social and moral values which were the fundamental basis for any society. The entire country had descended into a certain darkness. It seemed to him that everything he'd once believed in had collapsed. We were brought up in the spirit of loyalty to the party and to the people. We really did believe we were doing something useful for our country and for our people. But like many in the foreign intelligence services, he'd long been able to see that the party leadership was failing. There was no one who knew how to deal with the growing problems. The gap between reality and ideological dogma led to deep distrust in the country's leaders. Although the loss of empire and the loss of the decades-long Cold War hit men like Yakunin hard, he was among those who moved fast to embrace Russia's new capitalism. And while he said he hankered for the days of certainty, for the morality and values that he believed lay at the foundation of communism, that did not stop him from leaping into business before the Soviet Union had even collapsed, to pocket vast amounts of cash both for himself and, more importantly, to help preserve the networks of the KGB. For 4 years after the Soviet collapse, Yakunin remained an officer in the security services, never resigning his post. Although he insisted that he hadn't been taking orders, he admitted that the aim of his and his partner's business activities was partly to preserve what they could. We needed to redirect ourselves. We needed to create commercial enterprises that would earn money. We were all part of this process. The traditions of communication and cooperation remained. Yakunin joined forces with associates from St. Petersburg's prestigious Yoffa Institute for Technology and Physics, where he'd worked overseeing the Institute's international connections before being sent to New York. Among them was Yuri Kovalchuk, then 39 and a leading physicist of his day. Kovalchuk had a high forehead and a hawk-like gaze, and he worked closely with Andrei Fursenko. Both of them were deputies in the Yoffa Institute's work on sensitive semiconductor technologies deployed in laser and satellite systems. This was an area at the heart of the KGB's special interest, in which all manner of smuggling schemes had been deployed to bypass embargoes and steal technology from the West. Yakunin was believed to have worked on technology smuggling when he served undercover in New York. Their expertise landed Yakunin, Kovalchuk, and Fursenko a lucrative assignment: a deal to sell a batch of rare earth metals, including rare and strategic isotopes used in the aerospace and military industries, and in semiconductor technology. They were given the deal by a senior general in the KGB, said Yakunin. Once they'd pulled it off, one of the joint ventures they'd created, Temp, landed 24 million rubles in profits. It was a huge sum in those days, and it helped them take over Bank Russia. The three men had set up a string of such joint ventures in the final months before the Soviet collapse, as the KGB stepped up preparations for the transition to a market economy, and they'd already been working closely with Bank Russia. In the aftermath of the failed August coup, said Yakunin, they'd briefly feared that they might go out of business when their accounts in Bank Russia were frozen, along with the rest of the property of the Communist Party. But their connections and the cash they made in the rare earth metals deal saved them. High-ups in the local party and the KGB gave them the nod to take over Bank Russia and bring it back to life. We were people who were well known in the party structures of the city of Leningrad, said Yakunin. We had many contacts, and people trusted us. We were allowed to take a controlling stake in Bank Russia precisely because these people trusted and respected us. From the beginning, Bank Russia had been strategically connected to the Foreign Relations Committee run by Putin. Its offices were in the Smolny Institute, which had become the city's mayor's headquarters, and it began to play a key role in the creation of the Obchak, the common cash pot for Putin's men. The city's KGB-connected businessmen, including Yakunin, Kovalchuk and Fursenko, almost religiously continued to follow the prescriptions of the KGB laid out in the twilight years of the communist regime, when trade was to be ordered through joint ventures with foreign entities. All joint ventures were set up on the approval of Putin's committee, and most were directed to open accounts with Bank Russia. In one instance, millions of dollars were siphoned from the city budget through Bank Russia's accounts into a network of such companies linked to Putin's men. The cash had been funneled through a